Hello and welcome back to Cabincast with Oliver and Tom.
Hello.
We are here with another regular episode of Cabincast, trying to get back into the swing of things, but we're still not able to do these things in person, so we're not quite there yet. And the numbers for these are still a bit more down than we would like, but here we are. Today we are talking about Dunkirk.
Yes, Dunkirk, the film, not the historical event.
Indeed, the film, because that's mainly what we do, which came out in 2017.
Yeah,
And
and
we
it's-
saw at the cinema.
yeah, specifically the capital.
Yes, if you wanted to be that specific, I suppose. Yeah,
Yeah.
we saw this for Tom's birthday, in fact.
Yes, we did, and it still remains one of my favourite war movies of all time.
Mm-hmm.
Up there with 1917 and Darkest Hour, and Battle of Britain as well. But Battle of Britain is a classic as opposed to,
Battle of Britain is a classic like Dam Busters.
Mm.
Whereas Dunkirk is more modern.
Oh god, I haven't
I
seen Dam Busters in
enjoyed-
ages. I need to try.
Um,
I need to go back and look at that actually.
Dam Busters is a film that I like, but does also mind you of the times, especially with the
Yeah.
name of his dog.
Yes.
This is yeah. Dam
But
Busters
that-
now holds a very special place for me because I mean I always liked the music anyway, but
Mhm.
one of our neighbors who has lived in the street that we now live in since it was built, her husband, who has since passed away, he was the driver for
Oh wow.
the guy who invented the bouncing bomb.
Wow, that's very interesting.
It's
Wow.
yeah, I wish I had known it sooner and had a chance to speak to him about it, but
Yeah, that's
sadly
insane.
I did not.
Because that bomb basically made the whole thing possible.
Indeed. Indeed. But we're not here to talk about Dam Busters, though looking further back at an older story like that could be interesting. But we're here today to talk about Dunkirk.
Yeah. Which I suppose we should go into some of the stuff about the start of it. Directed by Christopher Nolan.
Indeed.
Produced by Emma Thomas and Christopher Nolan as well, and obviously written by Christopher Nolan. It is a war film with an ensemble cast portraying the evacuation at Dunkirk, or the Miracle of Dunkirk, as it's sometimes called over here in the UK.
And apparently Adam Driver was the narrator.
I don't remember a narrator during.
Me neither.
What? That's kind of a bit weird. I didn't. Okay. Well, the more you know, I suppose.
Yeah,
it was distributed
sure.
by Warner's Bros.
It was.
Warner's Brothers, not Warner's Bros. Although
Yeah.
do they rebrand to Warner's Bros, or are they still called Warner's Brothers?
It's Warner Brothers. That's just the shorthand.
Yeah. And it has a very interesting structure to how its plot is set out, because
It does.
they set out to tell the complete story of Dunkirk from the army's perspective, the naval perspective, and the air perspective. Because although there is a popular myth around the UK that the Air Force did nothing during Dunkirk, they did indeed fight over Dunkirk, and they fought quite a bit over Dunkirk. They just fought mostly up in the
They
clouds.
did so much, people just didn't see it, and so thought they weren't there, even though it's the Air Force. So of course you didn't see it because it's in the air.
Well, that's the thing. They were fighting further inland
Yeah.
to try and stop the bombers from even getting close, because it's a
Exactly.
lot. Even if you destroy a bomber over the beaches, that bomber's then going to crash.
Yep.
And that could arguably do as much, if not more, damage if it crashes with the bomb under it and then explodes.
Yeah.
Because that's going to send
Yeah.
shrapnel absolutely everywhere.
Yeah. So we
Um,
don't see that part of the Air Force.
no.
We just see Fortis, who are like 3. They're Spitfires or are they Hurricanes? They're
They
Spitfires,
are
I think.
Spitfires in their Spitfire Mark 1s, I believe, at the time. It
Mhm.
was only the Mark 1s that fought at Dunkirk.
And they
Um,
are they're the ones over the channel trying to just make sure boats don't get sunk.
yeah, which is the other main thing that the Air Force did, which was
Yeah.
try and prevent boats from being sunk. Because if there's any way to kill even more people than bombing them on the beach, it would have been killing them while on a boat. Because back in
Did
1940s,
you see
most people don't know how to swim.
or how to swim well?
Yeah.
But yeah, that
Um,
happens when they sink the bloody Red Cross boat,
yeah, which is
which is terrible.
yeah.
But anyway, before we get really into well, actually no, the plot. It's 1940. Um, the Allies have retreated to Dunkirk. Um, and it starts with a whole bunch of people. And you kind of get a look at all of them, and you're like, oh, cool, okay, so these are the guys we're following as they head back to Dunkirk. Nope, nope, nope. One of them.
Yeah,
The others all die in a German ambush immediately. It's just
it's
it's not a Saving Private Ryan or Hacksaw Ridge film. It's not rated R or rated 18, so it's not that bloody and grim, but
but it is pretty.
it's still pretty dark. It's a
Yeah,
war film. But yeah, he manages to get back to the French line and get onto the beach.
yeah,
And he meets Gibson, who is burying a body.
yes, burying a body and putting on some more of his uniform, which he presumably took off when he was digging.
Yes, definitely isn't the other person's uniform.
Yes.
But yeah, they attempt to get on board a hospital ship, but they're ordered off.
Yep.
But they do
Um,
manage to save another soldier,
yeah, they're ordered off, but they find another wounded soldier and try to use that
Alex.
on the
Yeah.
ship, wasn't it?
Yeah, Alex, who is played by Harry Styles, who I must be honest, I one didn't realize was Harry Styles, and two thought did a pretty damn good job.
Yeah.
Um, considering that when you often get musicians,
Hmm.
they're not always great. But yeah, I do not blame him after recording this film for not wanting to do more acting because
Hmm.
the amount of like being in freezing water and all that kind of stuff that he
Yeah.
would have had to be in for this, it doesn't sound pleasant. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of where we start. Um,
Yeah, that's where we start with the story, basically,
and
with the
then
army.
yeah, we have what's his name? Kenneth Branagh as Commander Bolton.
Hmm.
Um, and James Darcy as Colonel Winnant. I think he's the other guy who's there. And they're like, well, we've not got enough vessels. And he's like, it's okay. I have called it. What does he say? He's put in the call for
Yeah, he's putting
the
the call
merchant
to
navy kind of thing.
yeah the
So that's
merchant
not what
navy.
it's called, but
It's the reserve ships. It's the ships that at the
yeah,
start of the war were private ships were asked. They were called up and they were asked for. They were asked to sign up to be basically auxiliary ships if the military needed them. And as it happened, it was fortunate that so many people did because the military
yep,
definitely did need them.
they did. Mobilized is the
Mhm.
word
Yeah.
I meant. But yeah, so yeah, back in Weymouth. Have you been to Weymouth? I don't think I've been to Weymouth.
Uh, I have been down Dorset way, but I haven't been to Weymouth.
Yeah. A civilian sailor, Mr. Dawson, and his son Peter set sail on his boat Moonstone. Um, rather than let the navy commandeer her
It was
elf.
nice that they pointed this out
Mhm.
during the movie because a lot of the ships that went to Dunkirk, these little ships, the so-called little ships, as part of the myth that has become the Miracle of Dunkirk, it's been stated quite often that the it was ordinary people that took these ships over. And while a lot of them did have ordinary people on them and were steered by people on them, a lot
Mhm.
more of them were actually requisitioned by Royal Navy personnel and used by the Royal Navy.
Yeah.
And there were several as well which had Royal Navy personnel on board with the civilians.
Mhm. Which makes
Um,
sense.
yes. Um, really, it was only a few. Um, the person in particular who inspired Mr. Dawson, who we'll
Mhm.
talk about later on, um, obviously took his boat out before the military
Could stop him.
could, could stop them, which is the inspiration for what Mr. Dawson does here.
Yep.
And a similar sort of thing happened with a lot of ships that weren't on those registers, stuff like fishing ships, which were not supposed to be anywhere near war because they were providing valuable food for the home front, just showed up and helped out,
Yep.
which the military kind of didn't want them to do because, again, you're piloting a boat that's not necessarily valuable in a military sense, but in a civilian and economy sense is exceedingly valued right next to an active war zone. And yeah,
Yes.
so yeah, it
Indeed.
was good that they showed that um, because it
Yeah.
wasn't just civilians. There was an awful lot of Royal Navy personnel on
Mhm.
civilian vessels most of the time, with a few civilians on those vessels if the owner decided that they wanted to go and help, or and or a few, and with the remainder being a few civilian-owned vessels that were either taken by civilians because they argued with the Royal Navy into letting them go anyway, or they'd
Yeah.
taken it out before the Royal Navy could actually stop. And it's also
Yeah.
important to note, I think, as well, that while the little ships were what is remembered, a lot of the ships that actually did the work were the requisitioned little ships that were actually quite large. Um, in general.
Yeah.
So these were the riverine ships, the paddle steamers that were requisitioned because they were built for mass capacity and were actually able to do that. And we'll talk about them as well, I think, a little bit later.
Mhm.
Yep.
Just a quick note. Apparently, actually, um, Harry Styles was cast for his old-fashioned face, stated by Nolan, and he won the role after auditioning against hundreds of other candidates, and Nolan was unaware of his renown as a singer.
Nice. Good for
So
him.
he just did it. So good job as well. Um, yeah. Again, a thing to just point out now. One remember the music of this, which is Hans Zimmer. Again, keeping the relationship that they have between Hans Zimmer and Christopher Nolan and his work. Um, the
Gorgeous.
score is very, very tense a lot.
Yeah.
It's not. It's not. Apart from a couple of moments, it's not actually a score, unlike his others that I would listen to, because it's very stressful. Which is the point. Um,
Mhm,
so he began working on the score in 2016 and continued for 11 months, eventually creating a 100-minute demo. And
mhm.
for intensity, the script was taken to accommodate the auditory illusion of a shepherd tone, which had previously been explored in Nolan's 2006 film The Prestige. And this was coupled with the sound of Nolan's own pocket watch, which he recorded and sent to Zimmer to be synthesized. Um,
Mhm.
which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's very jarring.
It
Uh,
feels very, very stressful. It
it feels very
pipes up the
stressful.
tension.
Yeah.
So that's the general plot of the naval side, the little boats going to Dunkirk, and mostly follows the plot on this boat as they come across sinking ships and make their way to the beach themselves.
Yeah. Now, the other important thing we have to note is George.
George, yes, George.
Because George, who's their teenage, like, helping guy, joins them, uh, and they recognize, they rescue, a shivering shell shock soldier from a wrecked ship, who's played amazingly by Cillian Murphy,
Hmm.
who is clearly suffering from PTSD. You know, he's not okay, but he realizes that they're saying for Dunkirk. Um,
Yeah, and ends up
and
freaking
he's like,
out.
"Yeah, no, don't go back there. What are you doing?" And ends up injuring George because he gets hit on the head.
Mhm. Which is, yeah,
Renders
ends
him
up,
blind and ends up in him eventually dying
yeah,
by the end of the film, which is very sad.
it is very sad. Which I suppose with that leads us to the last bit, which is the air, where we can
The
talk about our
air,
three
yes, the
Spitfires.
three Spitfires. Who you've got Jack Loudon as Collins. You've got Michael Caine as the voice of Fortress leader.
Hmm.
Which again, Michael Caine's worked in lots of the Nolan projects, and also I think was in the Battle of Britain film, and so it's a
Hmm.
kind of reference to that as well.
Yeah,
And then Fortress One, Farrier, Tom Hardy, who again spends most of this film with his head in his
it is.
flight mask, and again is amazing
Mhm.
because
Yeah,
he's Tom Hardy.
and they go around doing sweeps in the English Channel, attempting to prevent German raiders from destroying evacuating ships,
Um,
Stukas and Heikels.
yeah, which goes so. Fortress One gets shot down, and then Collins gets shot down, but luckily he manages to get out,
Yep,
and is rescued by the Moonstone crew.
yep, and ends
Which
up with the Moonstone for the rest of the plot.
Yeah, which was a hilarious moment. Like he's in this really stressful thing where he can't quite get out the Spitfire as it's sinking, and eventually manages to get rescued and they put him up. He's just like, "Good morning."
Yeah,
It's just like so typically like British.
yeah, which all of this leads to
Hmm.
the climax of the movie, which is where our four stories sort our three stories sort of combined.
3.5. You know, you've got the commanders, which is kind of separate to the other
Yeah,
army people.
which is where our main characters on the beach, Tommy, Alex, and Gibson, and some Highlanders
Hmm.
um, from the Highlander Regiment, have found a beach trawler
Yep.
and they've refloated it. While they were refloating it, the Germans find them, and there's not necessarily a shootout, but they start shooting into the into the boat while the,
Again, it's super tense because they haven't found them. They're just
shooting
shooting
into
at
them,
it at target practice.
and to make sure they can't use the boat.
Oh no, I think it's just target practice, but then obviously they can't use the boat because the water starts coming in.
Yeah,
Um, and then they try and cover up the gaps, but then at least someone gets shot,
yeah.
and it goes very badly.
They get the trawler out, but obviously it's sinking.
Yeah.
And as the trawler's sinking, I believe there's another vessel that's sinking close by, or fairly close by. I think it's a destroyer,
Mm.
which is what they were trying to get to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the Moonstone shows up to start rescuing people from both
Yeah.
destroyers, along with a couple of other little boats. And then I think we get a German bomber coming in to do a attack run on one of the boats, which is where the Spitfire comes in to basically destroy that plane,
Yeah.
which
So
is not
yeah.
ideal because said plane then crashes into the sinking ship, which has spilled a bunch of oil everywhere, which lights the ocean on fire,
Yes, which is a bit of a nightmare, and thankfully they managed to save some people.
including our main
Um,
characters, apart from,
Gibson.
yeah,
So Alex in this moment uh accuses Gibson because he's not said much of being a German spy. Again, people doing desperate things.
yeah,
But Gibson reveals he's French and he stole the identity of a British soldier he buried, hoping to evacuate the British, which,
because,
is
yeah,
fair enough.
at the time, at least
Absolutely.
in the earlier points of the battle, there was a general belief amongst the British that it was a British evacuation, so only British people could get on it.
Yeah, it was
And
very
as
mean.
it was very mean because they turned away French soldiers, they turned away Belgium soldiers, they turned away soldiers from the Netherlands.
And a lot of
Um,
them were also the ones who were still protecting the British while the British were
Yeah.
standing on the beach trying to leave as well.
Well, it was less. I mean, in terms of the French, it was less the French units that were on. They're in the rear line defending, and more French units that had retreated with the British into that rear line.
Well, yeah, true.
Um, with the Belgium, that was sort of down to the fact that the Belgian king had surrendered just a few days earlier,
Yeah.
and they weren't really trusted at that point, and the
Yeah.
Netherlands had already fallen
Hmm.
at this point. And
Mm.
and again, the army in the Netherlands had completely surrendered because of German threats against Netherlands cities. I think it was Rotterdam that
Hmm.
they threatened to flatten Rotterdam with bombs, and the army of the Netherlands just sort of said, "Yeah, no, it will be easier just to let them roll over us and preserve our cities."
Probably wouldn't have been worth it. Yeah.
Which I will point out that the Navy of the Netherlands and the royal family of the Netherlands was like, "Nah, fuck that," and left for Britain immediately.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. Um. Yeah. No. So unfortunately, though, as the boat does begin to sink, Gibson gets tangled by a chain and drowns. That's
yeah,
pretty sad. It's a nearby minesweeper was sunk by a bomber.
yeah,
And the Moonstone maneuvers to take those in the water, including Tommy and Alex. And Peter discovers at this point George is dead. But when asked by the shell shock soldier, he lies and says that he'll be fine, which is
yeah,
the right decision
yes,
because Peter this whole time has just been kind of angry at him, understandably because he hurt his friend, and he doesn't understand why he's been so well, like you know,
yeah,
terrified and everything. But now that they're actually kind of there, it's
yeah.
it's it's at least a little bit more like okay, yeah,
It's real,
it's not this
and
guy's fault.
obviously he has shell shock as well. I'm not sure if we did mention
Yes,
that.
he
I
has
think,
shell
yeah,
shock too. Yeah.
which is
Um.
also pointed out by the characters
Hmm.
and is handled very respectfully because a lot of people who had shell shock at this time, it wasn't treated as a medical or psychological condition. It was just treated as toughen up and get over it. And
Exactly.
this attitude was pervasive, particularly in the American military. In fact, you'll hear stories about some of the more famous American generals actually basically getting into fisticuffs with their soldiers because
Hmm.
they think they were counted. There's some particularly famous events with George Patton in
Mm.
Sicily, I think, where he basically was going around hospitals trying to inspire his men, and he's seeing people there who weren't obviously injured, and he'd
Yeah.
end up getting into big old fights with them, and then a few times he'd throw punches, and most of the time later on it would come to light that either the man was ill due to some sort of disease, had
Hmm.
been sent back by their commander for some reason, or had
Hmm.
shell shock. And
Yeah.
obviously, by modern standards, and even by the standards of the day, it was not really acceptable to go and do that.
No, not
And he
really.
got into a lot of trouble over that. But it
Yes.
was a pervasive theory, a pervasive attitude at the time that shell shock was just people being pansies and trying to run away from war, not being real men,
Yeah.
which is ridiculous.
It is,
It's
and that's kind of why I think it's good that Peter's perspective does change
yes, by the end of the
by the end when he kind of understands a bit more. But yeah,
which leaves us then with the end of the movie and the tying up of the different plots because the Moonstone gets back with the soldiers it's rescued.
well, we've
And
skipped we've skipped the part where the rest of the ships arrive
oh
actually,
yes, oh did we?
which is the best part of the
Oh yes,
film.
sorry. Yeah, the rest of the ships do arrive.
Because the Moonstone stops like earlier to rescue the people of the ones who put all the other like
Yeah,
ships show up and they
yeah.
see the colonel I think is asked what do you see, and
He
Commander
says
Bolton says
home.
home. It's like great, and the music's great in this one moment,
Mhm.
and all the ships are like blowing their horns and stuff, and it's great. And then yeah, they
One of
start to leave.
mhm. And they
Um,
begin getting all of the guys off the
yeah,
beach.
and Farrier, Fortress One, Tom Hardy's character is like, well, I'm almost out of fuel.
Yep.
Just need to head back. Um,
And then he's out of fuel.
And then he's out of fuel, because he doesn't head back because
Yeah.
they still need protection, and there's
But
another
it
fighter,
does allow him to attack one last dive
and
bomber over the
he
beach.
takes out the last dive bomber and just kind
And
of goes silently floating along the beach, and everyone's like, "Yeah!" And it's a great
yeah,
moment again.
sets fire to his plane to prevent the Germans from taking
Yep,
it. And that
there's
is
the
the
Spitfire.
first time we see the Germans in the entire movie, because we get shots fired at them,
Yep,
but we never see a German soldier until the
we do not.
very end,
Yeah, yeah, we
which
do not
is
see them to the end, which is great.
part of um, part of what Christopher Nolan was going for. I believe he said this in an interview, was he wanted
Hmm.
the German army and the Germans to seem almost sort of like an existential threat.
Yeah,
You don't see them; they're not really human in the film.
yeah,
They're just the big threat which the characters are working against, trying to get away from. Can't be
yeah,
defeated. They are inhuman, because at this point the Germans to the Allies seemed unhuman. They hadn't
yeah.
suffered a defeat in
No,
the entire war at this point. They'd completely blitzed through Poland, and now they were doing the exact same thing to France.
yeah,
Um,
but yeah,
and just to quickly hop over to a completely different movie, by the way, in Darkest Hour, there's a really good scene which sort of showed, I think, some of the attitudes in the French high command at this point, where Churchill goes to France on a plane journey and basically says to the highest French military officer that he sees, he's like, "So what's your plan to defend against the Germans?" And the French officer just sort of like looks at him and is like, "There is no plan. There's nothing we can do."
yeah,
Which sort of speaks to how badly the French soldiers were screwed over by their military high command, because they had to get confirmation from higher ups of their orders before they could go do their orders. And by the time they got confirmation, the Germans were already in their back lines heading west.
yeah,
And the orders were completely unapplicable, and they had to send new orders. And this is how so many French units just got surrounded, cut off, destroyed. Um, and when the French were put in a situation where they could get their orders from high command, like in the defensive perimeter around Dunkirk and in Calais and other places, they did very well.
they did. Yeah,
Um, I guess we should go on to where the end, as the ships
yes.
return.
So
So
yeah, the end. So in all, over 300,000 men are evacuated. Commander Bolton stays to oversee the evacuation of the French, which he does.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, arriving back in Weymouth, the shell-shocked soldier does see George's body being carried away.
And our two surviving guys from the army, Tommy and Alex, board a train,
They do.
thinking that they're going to be booed and thrown off, like very much like the English football team when they lose badly in a football game.
Not even
Uh,
badly.
yeah, not even badly. That's the point.
Penalties.
I mean, I wasn't referring to the Euros, because, to be fair, the reaction to their loss of the Euros has been fairly good, I thought. I was more referring to the stuff before Gareth Southgate got in
Oh,
charge. Although,
true.
in
Actually, that was much
saying
worse.
that, certain things that have been done have been disgusting,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in regards to defacing certain monuments to various players.
Yeah, but like we said, back
Very
to the
mean.
World War II stuff. Yeah, they expect it to be like, people to
Yeah,
be upset with them, but no, it is very positive.
it's a hero's welcome, which
Most welcome.
did indeed occur. There was a lot of we'll get them next time type ideas.
Yeah,
Which ends, of course, with one of our characters, Tommy, reading Churchill's address.
yeah,
We will fight them on the beaches, which is arguably his most famous speech.
mm-hmm.
Which obviously came directly after Dunkirk, and is also the end, by the way, of Darkest Hour.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a great speech.
it's kind of interesting how Dunkirk and Darkest Hour parallel themselves, because while the British Army is in this desperate situation in France, Churchill was in a desperate situation in the UK trying to prevent his own party, because at this point he had the support of the Labour Party, but he didn't really have the support of the Conservative Party, from going behind his back and trying to make peace with Germany, which was not a good idea. So yeah, that's the plot of the movie. And I just gonna quickly pop in. I have 3 little stories to talk about here. So Mr. Driver, Mr. Dawson. I don't know why I said Mr. Driver. Mr. Dawson in the movie is based off Charles Lightoller, who is a very interesting character, and I believe we have done Yarn Hub's video on him.
Yep, I think so.
But yeah, Charles Lightoller was the highest surviving officer on the Titanic, and later on served in the First World War as a destroyer captain, before, as you would expect, inspiring Mr. Dawson, who goes out to Dunkirk, going out to Dunkirk with his son Roger and a young sea scout called Gerald Ashcroft. On their ship, the Sundown, which is still preserved, by the way. You can go see the Sundown at Ramsgate Maritime Museum, which is incredible. And he did this rather than allow his motor yacht to be requisitioned by the Admiralty, which is exactly what happens to Mr. Dawson. Another little story about this is he was licensed on his ship to carry 21 passengers. He repatriated a total of 127 servicemen on one journey.
Yeah.
So, yeah, a lot more than he was supposed to be carrying on his little boat.
Yeah.
And on the return journey, Lightoller evaded gunfire from an enemy aircraft using a technique described to him by his youngest son, Herbert, who had joined the RAF and had been killed earlier in the war, which, again, parallels what we see in the movies, which is hilarious because people call that part of the movie not accurate to history. There you go.
Yeah.
Although I will say it wasn't a Bf 109, which we see in the movie. It was a Stuka in real life. His second son as well, Trevor, because he had 3 sons, I believe, in real life, may have had more, was actually serving with the 3rd Division in Dunkirk, and he had already been evacuated before the Sundown had even reached Dunkirk. And he continued to serve in the small vessels pool, so that sort of auxiliary small vessels for the duration of the war.
We did actually miss out another bit.
Oh, did we?
I just remembered. There's another plane that dive bombs the Moonstone at one point.
Yes.
And he manages to.
Yeah, that was the Bf 109 that I was talking about.
Yes, so it was, wasn't it? Yeah, and he manages to
evade it. In real life, it was a Stuka.
It was a Stuka, like you said, yeah.
In real life,
we forgot to mention that in regards to the film point. But
yeah, the second story was about not a British personnel, but a New Zealander, Alan Christopher Al Decree, who fought with the RAF at Dunkirk, and he's the inspiration of God damn it, what's his name? Tom Hardy's character. Tom Hardy's character, which is Farrier, I believe. I combined Farrier with character there. That was interesting. And the RAF now shifted to tightly covering Dunkirk and the English Channel to protect ships from the evacuation fleet as much as possible. He was flying with number 54 Squadron and flew several times a day to Dunkirk during the evacuation. On the afternoon patrol of the 27th of May, Decree destroyed a Junkers Ju-88 dive bomber, which is a different type of German bomber to the Heinkel that we see in the movie. Yep. Attacking a hospital ship and shared in the destruction of another. The next day, Decree led a squadron down to 8 serviceable aircraft on its final dawn patrol before it was withdrawn for rest. Coming across a Dornier Do-17 light bomber, he led a section of flight in pursuit while the rest of the squadron continued with its patrol. In making an attack on the Dornier D7, his own Spitfire was damaged by machine gun fire from the rear gunner, and this forced him to make an emergency landing on a Belgian beach, during which he was knocked unconscious. After coming to, he made his way to foot to a nearby town, where his head injuries were dressed. He hitched a ride on a British Army lorry and boarded a boat to Dover, where he took the train back to London and travelled to Hornchurch, from where he had taken off 19 hours earlier. During his boat ride to Dover, he was subject to scathing comments from soldiers about the effectiveness of the RAF fighter cover, which is what we see, I believe, at the end of the movie when they're getting off the boat. The British soldiers have a bit of a go
At Collins, yeah, they do.
Collins, yeah. And the final story I want to talk about is a ship which is also still in existence, the PS Medway Queen, which is currently docked. Where's it currently docked? It's registered at Rochester. It very well may still be at Rochester. But this ship is just incredible. Its nickname, its one and only nickname, is the Heroine of Dunkirk.
Ooh, that's pretty. Quite the nickname.
So yeah. So in May 1940, Operation Dynamo was launched to rescue the retreating British Army soldiers from Dunkirk in northern France. HMS Medway Queen became part of the flotilla of little ships. Medway Queen was fitted with a 12-pounder gun and 2 machine guns. They left with paddle steel Sandown, Thames Queen, Graceful Fields, Queen of the Thanet, Princess Elizabeth, Langwood Bell, and Brighton Bell, and made 7 crossings. On her first trip, soldiers were taken off the beach in lifeboats and ferried to the ship. On her return to Dover, her arrival coincided with an air raid where she shot down a German aircraft outside the harbour. One of the ships she was with, the Brighton Bell, ran over a sunken wreckage and began to sink herself. All passengers and crew were rescued by the Medway Queen without loss of life, and heavily overloaded, she made for harbour. On her second trip, she took soldiers directly off the beach. This required more skill, but was much faster. These men were discharged at Ramsgate rather than Dover, where the vessel was fueled and repositioned. On Monday, the 3rd of June, Vice Admiral Ramsay gave the order that all ships were to leave Dunkirk by 2:30 the following morning. This was the Medway Queen's 7th ship trip. She was at the mole in Dunkirk when a destroyer, moored astern of her, was driven forward by an explosion and smashed her starboard paddle box. She sustained considerable damage. The Medway Queen limped back to Dover with 400 French soldiers on board.
Oof.
She gained 4 awards for gallantry, having shot down 3 enemy aircrafts, made a crossing that rescued 7,000 men. In view of this remarkable achievement in rescuing so many Allied troops from France, she earned the title the Heroine of Dunkirk. In 1942, she was converted to a minesweeping training ship and served out the rest of the war in that capacity.
That is pretty amazing.
And just coincidentally as well, that ship saved the most people from the shores of Dunkirk when compared to any of the other little ships.
Yeah,
so an incredible achievement. And again, you can. I'm not sure if you can go visit her, but she is still in existence.
Yeah, it is still a ship.
It is still very much a ship, and for a while it was a nightclub as well.
Huh.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
Let's have a look. I'm just going to see the society content. Still apparently even able to run because they've been moving it around.
Yeah.
Which is insane. So yeah, those are 3 little stories that inspired. I mean, Medway Queen didn't inspire anything really, but it's just such a good, powerful story that I thought it deserved to be here.
For sure. So, other interesting stuff about the creation of the film, on the flip side, is that Nolan first conceived the film in the mid-1990s when him and his future wife Emma Thomas sailed across the English Channel following the path of many of the small boats in the Dunkirk evacuation.
Yes.
And that he considered improvising the entire film instead of writing a script, but Thomas convinced him otherwise. And then in 2015, he wrote a 76-page screenplay, which was about half the length of his usual script and his shortest to date. And its precise structure necessitated fictional characters rather than ones based on eyewitnesses, which does make sense.
It gives you a slight bit of freedom. Although,
Yeah,
again, several of these characters are clearly based off real people,
yeah,
particularly
for sure.
Dawson. I think there's a
Um,
couple of other pilots involved in Dunkirk that went towards Tom Hardy's character.
mhm. The story, as we know, is told from three perspectives: land, 1 week of action; sea, 1 day of action; and air, 1 hour of action. Uh, Nolan structured the film from the point of view of all the characters, intending to use visuals rather than dialogue and backstory, and he wanted to incorporate the so-called snowball effect that had previously only been used in the third acts of other films.
Mhm,
Which, yeah, it does very much feel like that. Nolan said that he approached research as though it was for a documentary and was attracted to the project because of its inversion of the Hollywood formula. The Battle of Dunkirk was not a victory and did not involve American armed forces,
mhm.
but nevertheless demanded a large-scale production, which is true.
Yeah,
Um, because obviously, and understandably, the Americans
it is
love to see Americans being heroic and stuff, and they did do plenty of that stuff.
mm,
But it's good to see some of the other stories also
being
have a
told.
bit
Yes,
more.
it's it's also quite nice to point out that this increased the awareness of the events of Dunkirk because outside of the UK and
Yes.
France, Dunkirk is not really talked about that much.
No, which
And
is a thing that I always forget because again, we're not outside of
yeah,
England.
from our
Yeah.
perspective here in Britain in the UK, it is one of the most important events in World War II because if we didn't get those people off France,
It'd be a bit awkward.
well, it'd be very awkward because we had very few troops actually in the UK at the time. The majority of our troops were all across the empire.
Yep.
Um,
Be a bit awkward.
and I mean, not only the additional protection against the potential invasion, but also the scale of the potential disaster
Yeah.
that was occurring there. And then the bravery, no matter how much it's exaggerated in the myth of Dunkirk, and the miracle of Dunkirk of the little boats, is something that remains fairly moving to
Yeah.
British audiences. Um, you know, uh,
Yeah.
these ships were civilian ships that were not designed anywhere close for the action that they saw. And there were several civilians who did go out there and very bravely put their lives and their ships on the line
Yeah.
to save the lives of others. Um,
Indeed.
so yeah,
And yeah, again, we've got more stuff like that. Nolan postponed Dunkirk until he had acquired sufficient experience directing large-scale action films to convey the perspective of soldiers on the beach, for whom contact with the enemy was extremely limited and intermittent. Like you said earlier, he did not show Germans on the screen. He also omitted scenes of Winston Churchill and the generals in war rooms, as he did not want to get bogged down in the politics of the situation.
mhm,
Um,
which is something that is gone into far more by um,
um, yeah, the
Darkest Hours.
Darkest Hours, yeah.
That's very much like I say. It is almost it's almost interesting to watch Dunkirk and then to watch Darkest Hours,
It
which is
is
what I
quite
did.
fitting how clever the two of them connect, considering how
Yeah,
far apart they were.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, Nolan showed key members of the crew 11 films that had inspired him for this, which is All Quiet on the Western Front, sure.
obviously.
The Wages of Fear, which I've not heard of particularly.
I haven't heard of that one.
Um, Alien, which in
Yeah,
terms of tense and stressed, yep, for sure. Speed
that's the
um,
one with the bus, isn't it?
is the bus one, so again, yep, makes
Keanu
sense.
Reeves and the bus.
Yeah. Unstoppable,
Not heard of that one.
Denzel Washington and Chris Pine, but yeah, I've not heard of it either. It is based on the real life CSX 8888 incident. Oh, a runaway freight train and two men who attempt to stop it.
Oh, okay.
So it's similar to Speed in a
Oh,
sense, I think. I've not heard of
I've
that one, but
I've heard of the event that this was based off of. So it's where I'm pretty sure there was it was like a train where he'd gone out to change the tracks because no one was there and he needed to get on the right tracks, but he for some reason left the train running and the train just sort of went off and ran on its own for a bit, and they had
nah.
to try and stop it because the train was just off on its own.
Well, whatever the reason was, again, it sounds like another very stressful, tense, high-stakes situation.
Mhm.
Also, a film from the 1920s entitled Greed.
Again, not a clue about what
Which
that
we
is.
don't know about. Sunrise from 27, which is similar. Ryan's Daughter from the 70s, which is a British epic romantic drama film, apparently set
Yep.
in 1917, 1918, to do World War One, so I guess that makes sense. Battle of Algiers. Yep.
Haven't seen, but I know the events
Heard
it's
of.
based off.
Yep.
Yeah.
Chariots of Fire, which
Yes.
the Olympics
Obviously.
one, and yeah, of course.
Such a good
And
song, Chariots of Fire.
it's a great film. And The Foreign Correspondent, which is the
Okay.
Alfred Hitchcock spy thriller film from the 40s.
Oh, okay. Only
But yeah,
two of which are war films.
only two of which are war films, exactly. But yeah, lots of them are very high levels of stress
Mm.
and that kind of stuff. Yeah, so the other thing was filming wise, the weather sucked on some days, and they had all these like pleasure
From
boats,
Northern Europe.
and it made it a lot more
Difficult.
a lot more well, made it very clear how dangerous it would have been
Yeah.
for these boats to have been going across such water because they are flat.
Yeah, they can easily get swamped in it.
Exactly. It's
I
very,
mean,
very dangerous.
I don't know the exact statistics, but there has to be a decent number of sailboats and pleasure boats that are just lost in the channel
Hmm.
every year. I think it's also important to note that for the filming of like various scenes, particularly with Spitfires and boats, they had to modify entire
Yes.
boats and entire ships, and particularly the large ships had to be modified massively.
Yeah.
I believe some of the German vessels, a lot of the German vessels are modified Russian planes
Mm.
that are modified to look like that. But some of the Spitfires, at least the Spitfires you aren't shown crashing, are real Spitfires.
Yeah, they were. They were real ones.
Which is, the real Spitfires were provided by the Imperial War Museum, Duxford, which is the largest aviation museum in the UK. And I'm not sure. I may have been there.
I'm pretty sure I've been there a long time ago, but
I'd be surprised if I haven't, because my dad does have a tendency to bring me to these places.
yeah, I would be surprised
Oh,
if
they've
you
got a
hadn't too.
Concorde there.
I would almost be surprised if we. Oh no, maybe I went with primary school rather than secondary school. But anyway.
Figure out if that Concorde's a BA or a Air France. Yeah, British Aircraft Corporation. It's BA1, which means it would have been a few years ago. One of the Concordes that my dad was asked to check up on.
Indeed. And so, the kind of linking to that in a sense, historical accuracy of the film.
Yeah, this was one that some people had some issues with for some reason.
Indeed. So pretty accurate. For the most part, there were a couple of changes that had to be made. For example, the German fighters all had the yellow noses to make them more obvious to determine as the German planes.
Yeah,
and they did have those, just not until a month after Dunkirk.
Yeah, it's a thing that was, I think, popularized particularly in the UK mindset by Battle of Britain, because all the British, all the fighters there have yellow noses, and it becomes a sort of typical trope in German fighters, at least for the remainder of the war.
And so yeah, that one was one which made sense to have added. Again, it was generally noted for its generally realistic representation of historical evacuation, and accurately depicts a few Royal Air Force planes dogfighting Luftwaffe over the sea, limited to 1 hour of operation by their fuel capacity. However, the combat is usually much higher than it was portrayed.
Yeah. yeah, in general, most you see that again
Well,
with a lot of their films, where they have the combat close to the ground. But when you're flying close to the ground, there is a very obvious problem for fighter planes because you want to maneuver in a fighter plane to try and avoid getting hit. But if you maneuver in the wrong way when you're close to the ground, you end up going splat.
Yeah, you hit the ground.
And that
Kind of
is
need
less.
you.
Yeah, that's less than good. So what tends to happen is dogfights start at a high altitude and end up working their way down
And wind low and lower as time
as
went
the
on.
planes lose momentum, lose speed, until eventually they end up on the deck if it goes that long.
Yeah.
And then it's just a case of waiting for one of them to make a mistake, and usually they would end with splat rather than kaboom.
Mhm.
Um,
Indeed. But
or
yeah,
alternatively, one would get away. But
yeah. But yeah, it also points out that 1940 destroyers and fighter planes were indeed held back from the battle, as the Royal Navy and Air Force would have been the sole defenders against invasion. There was indeed a temporary withdrawal of destroyers during the early stages after considerable losses. However, an appeal to the Admiralty by Admiral Ramsay reversed that decision.
yep,
Um, the accurate depictions of how small boats attempted to evade aerial attacks, as we've discussed, and of
mhm,
how soldiers returning to England saw a civilian population largely unaware or unaffected by the war. And
yep,
the British officers did initially refuse to evacuate French soldiers, although Churchill later insisted the French be evacuated alongside the British.
yeah.
Um, and it was acknowledged as well by veterans that it was pretty accurate. Although Branagh said that some thought it was louder than the battle, which it was a pretty loud film.
It was,
Um,
yeah, but I think that was more to amp up the tension because in
yeah.
the first scene you got this like quiet moment of the British moving through the town, and then you immediately know what you're in for when the last
Hmm.
cracks begin starting, and you see people die, and then one main character is off running
Yep.
on his own.
Exactly.
Um,
Um, and yeah, like we said, although some events are based on history, they are composite characters,
mhm,
especially Branagh's, like Commander Admiral guy.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, like we were just saying,
it's
when the
the composite
beaches,
character of I think an admiral and an army general, if I remember
yeah,
correctly.
something like that. But yeah, like we were saying, when the beach shot scenes were shot, the weather was worse than during the rail evacuation, and then explained that this helped to understand the dangers faced by the pleasure boats.
Mhm.
Um, and apparently, in one scene, a non-commissioned officer gave a salute without wearing his military beret, which a veteran pointed out as an inaccurate protocol. But
Yeah,
he looked pretty cool, so it's fine.
yeah.
Also, the final thing, and the thing that I think got the most complaint was the fact that the involvement of French, African, and Indian soldiers in the evacuation was
Yeah,
either limited or left out of the film. But I think that's because there were different places, weren't there?
yeah. There were different places that were getting evacuated. For one, it's important to note that the largest group of soldiers at Dunkirk that weren't British were the French. And the French at this particular time had made a particularly selfless decision, which was they put their soldiers up front fighting the Germans.
Yeah,
Um, it's a bit of a myth that is still around with Dunkirk, even in the UK and elsewhere, but particularly in the United States, that the Germans let the British go during this
yeah,
time. That's not what happened. What happened was Goering promised Hitler that he could destroy all of the British forces from the air with the
yeah,
Luftwaffe, which is why the fighting over Dunkirk in the air was so very fierce. Um, at certain points in the campaign of Dunkirk, the Royal Air Force was losing more planes than it would lose during certain days of Battle of Britain.
yeah,
Um, and that's considering the fact that the British planes had limited range and were flying over the English Channel, only had up to an hour's flight time in their actual combat positions. So
yeah,
the
exactly.
fighting was especially fierce because the Luftwaffe was actively attempting to just destroy everything on the beach and
Yeah,
all of the boats out to sea and the ports in Britain. all at the same time.
Mhm.
And most importantly, Hitler realized it was a mistake after a couple of, I think it was a week, where it became obvious that the British were still very much successfully completing their invasion, and he sent the German army back in. And during that time, it was only the French rearguard that prevented the Germans breaking through to the beach and being able to fire on the evacuation.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, the movie isn't focusing on the heroics of the French defending the British evacuation,
No.
and its narrative requires a German army and a German air force which is an unbeatable threat.
Yeah.
So showing the German army getting basically repulsed by the French at the back would weaken the narrative.
Wouldn't work with the narrative, but
Wouldn't
that
work for
would
the
definitely
narratives.
be another good film to see.
It would be. It'd be an incredible film to see. What we do get from the French is we get a few scenes where we do see these badass people at the back, and as our character is running towards the
We do,
beach,
yeah.
he encounters a French roadblock, and it is very clear that these French men are standing there and staying there
Yeah.
to defend the British. So
Mhm.
it does,
There's a
if not
couple of
show
moments.
them, honor them.
Yeah.
And then the other prominent French scenes that we see is when the French are trying to, a couple of French soldiers are trying to get onto British boats where they're being denied, because
Mhm.
that was the policy at the time. And
Mhm.
of course, through one of our characters, who is a French soldier who is disguised himself as a British soldier to try and get on the boats
Yeah.
and away from the Germans, which is a perfectly acceptable reason to be trying
Yeah.
to get off. You know,
Absolutely.
not everyone is up to defending the rear lines.
Yeah.
While a lot of French did, there was probably just as many who really, really wanted to get away.
Mhm.
In
Exactly.
regards to soldiers from Africa and India, they were there. In particular, the French Foreign Legion
Yep.
was part of the French rear line and fought bravely at Dunkirk. But as we've already spoken about the French rear line and why it wasn't really in the film, that sort of explains it. The only thing we get really for Africans at Dunkirk is again that scene with the couple of French soldiers. There's a fellow from the Foreign Legion there trying to get on the boats,
Yeah.
which is a nice reminder that they were there.
Mhm.
But we don't really see anything else of it.
We do not.
Although, again, the French Foreign Legion were part of the rear line defence and
Yeah.
were not really on the beach until it came time to evacuate the French.
Yeah.
Which we don't see in the
We do not.
movie. As for Indian soldiers, they're completely absent from the movie, which is a bit of a shame because they were fighting with the British and they were the largest section from the British Empire at Dunkirk.
Yeah.
But that still only amounted to a very small percentage of the British forces actually at Dunkirk.
Yeah.
So the majority of the British soldiers there were British. So you can sort of forgive him for not showing it, although it would have been nice to at least have seen a few Indian soldiers there, about like we see in, say, for example, 1917, where
Yeah.
during a couple of the scenes we see some Indian soldiers riding with the Lancastrians,
Mhm. Yeah.
just as a reminder that they were there. Overall, I think the argument that there should be more involvement from these soldiers misses the point a bit. Other than the absence of Indian soldiers and maybe Belgian soldiers, which were the other group of soldiers that were there in
Yeah.
large amounts of numbers
Mhm.
on the beach, it's not bad. Again, the French and the French Foreign Legion, which represents the majority of the Africans there, were fighting in the rear line, and we've already explained why that wasn't
Yeah.
part of the movie.
Exactly.
Um, the absence of Indian soldiers is disappointing, but who knows? They're filming this in France. They might not have been able to get a hand on any actors or any extras because there was an awful lot of extras in this
Yeah.
used to fill up the British soldiers. So they might not have just been able to get the people in for it.
Maybe. It's a thing that seems like a slight oversight. Um, it's it's not a truly horrendous thing. But it's a shame that it yeah, it
I
should have.
mean,
You wouldn't imagine it would have taken too
put
much,
it this
but
way, I probably can find the actual numbers quickly.
yeah.
For the Dunkirk, for like the actual thing. Let's have a look.
Hmm.
So yeah, at Dunkirk, um, United Kingdom, Belgium, Canada. There were Canadians there apparently. I didn't know that.
Oh,
France, India, Netherlands, Poland, and West African troops were
yeah.
at Dunkirk. As for how many were actually, say for example, Indian, so how many Indians were at Dunkirk? There was 600 Indian soldiers fighting at Dunkirk, and compare that to how many soldiers were actually at Dunkirk. Which I need to go look down and probably find how many were evacuated. Would probably be an easier way to find out.
Well, 300,000 at least at
Yeah,
first, right? So
three hundred
yeah.
thousand.
So
So yeah, it's a
it's a
very
very small number.
it's a very small percentage of the troops there, so it can sort of be forgiven.
Yeah,
Because
it can
if we're
be
going to be splitting
excused.
hairs about the Indians, then we might as well split hairs about the Belgians, which had more people there. They had around
Yeah.
2,000. The Netherlands, which had around 50 to 100 Polish fighters as well. Although I'm not sure if the Polish were fighting in the sense of on the ground or whether they were with the RAF.
This is true.
Well, no, actually, it's saying Polish army in France, so that might have been a French formation in the rear guard as well.
I was gonna say I don't remember when the Polish Air Force joined in
Oh, cool.
the
Polish army in
area.
France. I never knew about this. Apparently, there was the Polish actually set up an army in France
I did not know that either.
um, that fought during the Battle of France.
Huh.
Army
The more
began
you know.
operation.
But
Uh,
that doesn't particularly matter for us
no,
right
it
now.
doesn't.
We are
Um,
done with the film.
yes,
So yeah,
I guess
we're
that's
basically there. Yeah,
yeah. I guess we'll do a quick discussion on our opinions of the film. I think it's an
indeed.
amazing film, as I think I've already stated. It's one of my favorite films of all time.
Mhm.
It's easily one of my favorite war films.
Mhm.
Um, just so much effort was put into this film to make it what it was, and
Yeah.
I really appreciate the way it was sort of put together with the
Sure.
1 week, one day,
1
1
day, 1
hour
hour. Yeah.
type of stuff. I know that caused a few issues. For example, my parents actually not dislike but are indifferent towards Dunkirk because they can't get their heads around that concept.
Yeah, I see some people
Um,
who can't follow it. And I'm like maybe if like you
it's
didn't know that, but if you like watched it again, like it's
Yeah, it's that plus my mum and dad do kind of like a central character to sort of talk about, and they went into it expecting like Winston Churchill and some of the more political sides behind it, and I think they were ultimately looking for Darkest Hour in Dunkirk, put it that way,
which
um,
is not
which is
not what they were
which
gonna get.
not what they were going to get. And when we did go to see Darkest Hour, that's something that my dad said. So I thought that was what Dunkirk was going to be like. I'm like, okay. So I'm glad you found the film that you
Well, the film we
liked
wanted
about
to
the
what
film.
one of them was called Dunkirk.
Yes, one of them was called Dunkirk, and one of them was called Darkest Hour, which is directly after referencing one of Churchill's speeches.
Churchill's quote. So
Yeah,
to
and as far as I'm aware, Churchill did not step foot at Dunkirk, at
I
least
don't
in
think
this
he did.
period.
Yeah.
He very well could have. He very well might have after they had actually completed the invasion,
Yes.
D-Day and that sort of stuff.
True.
Um,
But
it
yeah,
was one of the
okay.
first films to actually make me cry in the cinema.
Yeah.
One of the only films to make me cry in the cinema. One of the only pieces of media to make me cry.
Mm.
Um, which was a bit awkward because it was with all of you guys at my birthday party. It also made Stephen cry, didn't it, as well?
Stephen, I think. I mean, it made me like tear up. I think it
It
made
made
Dan
it made
tear up
yeah, it made everybody tear up. It
because
was
it's a great moment
such a good moment.
when all the ships come. Is the bit we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Again, there's a lot of emotions here in the UK regarding that because it is regarded as a miracle. It's regarded as something that the people who did there were very, very brave to go and do.
yeah,
And so it does stir up a lot of emotions that perhaps the American audience did not feel as keenly. Although notably, it did do very successful in the United States.
it did. It did. This is true.
Um, Overall, it's the highest ranked of. Well, it was the highest ranked of my war films until 1917 came out,
Mm-hmm.
which does have it beat, I
Yeah,
will say,
yeah,
because it manages to do a similarly artsy style of filming, but with two very likable, followable characters that we
mm-hmm.
follow for most of the movie. No spoilers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I mean, it's a close run thing because I do love this movie, and I will say it is one of my 10 out of 10s.
Okay, there we go. So for me, I've only seen it the one time, which was in 2017. I've seen a couple of like bits and pieces of it again since then, but the main film I've only seen like once all the way through. So memories of it's a bit foggy, but like the actors are all great. Like I said, Harry Styles did actually impress me. Tom Hardy, surprising no one, is really great. Same with Cillian Murphy. Same with everyone on the boat and Kenneth Branagh. They're all good. Um, and I do really like the score and how tense it is. Um, I'm often not a big fan of like war films and that kind of stuff anyway. Um,
Mhm.
and I do quite like the moment, you know, when all the ships arrive.
Yeah,
And we do get the some of the cooler moments.
I,
But it is
I
just
think
for
a problem with certain war films is you end up glorifying. You don't want to end up in the position where you end up glorifying war.
true, very true.
Um, and there are quite a few, like even with the older films that we like talk about, like A Bridge Too Far, and Battle of Britain, they
Mm-hmm.
don't tread. They manage to tread that quite well, and I think Dunkirk does as well. But there are certain films that I can think of off the top of my head, which do historical stuff quite badly by either villainising the opposing side. The Americans can be particularly guilty of that,
Yeah.
or by failing to show that war is truly bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing with war. I'm not pacifistic in my beliefs when it comes to war. I do believe that every now and again a war comes along which is necessary to fight. World War II is a good example.
Yep.
Um, it wasn't an inevitable war, but it was a necessary war by the
Yeah.
time that it occurred.
Indeed.
But that does not change the fact that my opinion on war is that it is truly a barbaric thing to be doing
Yeah.
and to be
For sure.
participating in. There is no morally good war.
No. And I
Um,
mean that is why like on like films like Saving Private Ryan or Hacksaw Ridge are very good films
yeah,
because of how brutal they are.
yes.
It's like some people like, you know, for sure are for into that, but it is primarily just shocking because yeah,
Mhm.
war is terrible. But
Um,
anyway, back to just so what I was saying. Yeah, so it's like for me, it's like I enjoy 1917
mm,
because like the main character centers around is just he's just a guy.
yeah,
But we do have this main character, and the fact it's all done in one shot is really cool, and the music's stunning. Um, I connect with that story more, and to be fair, maybe that is because it's all just one story.
yeah,
Um, so as of right now, I think this is It's probably a 7 out of 10 for me. It's maybe an 8. Like I said, it's been a while. I probably need to rewatch it. But
Mhm.
I totally get why it is a 10 out of 10 for you.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
it's in that sort of class of movies which are really high up
exactly.
on the top list. It's one of the films that I come back to rewatch quite a bit.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's the majority of the films up there tend to be either historical films, or they tend to be sci-fi films, or they tend to be fantasy films. That type of brand is what I tend to go
Sure.
towards. And when they're in that sort of class, that group, I
Hmm.
always give them 10 out of 10s.
It does tend to happen. Yeah.
It is just those are the type of films. Even despite some of their very small flaws, in my opinion, these films are just so near and dear to me that I always rate them that way.
Yeah, and that's fair.
Mhm.
I do definitely get that. And yeah, I might rewatch and be like, no, this is better than I remember. It's entirely possible. I would not put it that
Yep.
past me. But yeah. Well then,
Um,
okay. I think that's
yeah, I think that should be
everything.
it. I mean, we could do a quiz, but I don't really feel like it.
Not that we're not good enough of us, unfortunately. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I suppose with any luck, this will be one of the last ones we do in this sort of style.
I'm
Hopefully, we can go
hoping
back
so.
to
Hopefully
actually
we can
doing
go
some
to actually
music
being a Cabincast.
again, instead of everybody sits in their room with their headphones on cast.
Indeed.
Um, yeah.
But until then, thank you for listening. And we will see you in the next one. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Cabincast. For more episodes, go to www.cabincast.podbean.com or use the Podbean app. You can now also find us on iTunes and Pocket Casts under Cabincast and on YouTube. The uploads here are quite behind. Finally, you can find us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Cabincast. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.